My name's Sean, and I'm from California. I just wanted to put the microphones up again. And, they're still muted. We both in the chat. You could just put.
So you say.
Yeah.
He just like insults the entire library. This is the worst library
So
I've ever seen.
I could go in the back pocket
I hate it.
from pocket, and then the easiest way to do it is that you can just kind of run it through your jacket.
This has nothing to do with me.
And what I'll do is I'll just put it on your collar.
Okay.
Okay. If you're able to run it through the shirt, that's cool. For my students, that's fine too. Up to you. It's not too conspicuous. It's still rather inconspicuous. Yeah. So you could put it right here, and that would kind of take care of things.
He did give you guys the flesh colored mic, like in, I guess that's flesh color. It's kind of like in the ones they wear on the face for head top.
So one that's on. I would, yeah, you can put it like around the back of your jacket.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
If you'd like your hand with that. Okay.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like,
Yeah, I'll have my wife.
okay, yeah, so if you can bring it like over the shoulder. Yeah, so feel free to speak or whatever volume. Yeah, I'm just gonna come into the other college. Okay. Cool. All right, thank you guys, and my name's Sean. Thank you, fellas.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my god. That's really ridiculous. You know, that actually reminds me a little bit. Have you ever seen Art Audio? But there's this, it's like the science fiction and there's company that makes like a script on Amazon, and it's called Worry Free, which what they do is in exchange for gifts. And it just reminds me of but they have all these ads. Are you just like oh, okay.
It's a favorite student.
Aww.
Just a student begging for a ride. That sounds more.
What, yeah, what do you mean? I'm learning an introduction.
Like,
What do you mean?
yeah. Time and then find your good I'm really, yeah, I'm on a West Coast. That's not California. I'd love to go back.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, Charlie Clark.
Yeah. Oh,
I
let's
have, yeah.
Oh, interesting. Oh, wow. All right. Oh, yeah, I forgot to add, we have, just to, very thanks for coming. We appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing this. Brief introduction. You guys go out. You guys want to go ahead?
Yeah, just you will.
We're gonna kill it.
Yeah.
Break the leg.
Yeah. Hopefully not. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm a plus if you survive.
Yeah, I don't even know 5 years in the military.
Yeah, I am. There are more questions than military.
Oh, I'm a horrible.
Yeah.
But it's, I talk about 8, and it's,
Yeah.
but it's always.
That's my kid. I don't.
Yeah. I knew my bike. Oh. It's like, yeah.
I'd like to learn that. Like I guess. Situationally aware. Like when I'm not walking.
Have you done
I'm honored to be here. Well, first of all, I'm well. Because of COVID, I was want. So I was getting all the books.
Yeah. Happy to have you in the space. We started back up full swing. I've been in this position 6 months, but I started written in publishing for 25 years. But, we started back up full swing. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. What? What?
Yeah. We've been already done serious things. For us, for both of us, the football legendary people third. Push back into the programming. We're still finding people if we're gonna have like people with much more be really
Good evening. How is everyone? Good. I'm well. Welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement. Very happy to have you all out tonight. A couple brief housekeeping notes before we start. Stuart and Lyle are going to speak for about 45 minutes in discussion, and then we'll have time for your questions, about 15 minutes. There's an audience microphone here, and there will be one there. If you have questions, please direct them to the mics. We have a nice, robust virtual audience as well. We're an audience that is watching virtually. They're not a virtual audience. I say that, I always mess it up, and then I repeat it, and it's funny. After the event, we'll be assigning outside. Our good friends, Urban Read Books, are outside. They have a location in Greenmount. They have a new one at the new Lexington Market. So just so you know, please buy a book if you might have a chance, and have it signed by Lyle after the program. And finally, some folks took advantage of this. Some folks are just learning about it. But we started a free parking initiative for all our author programs here at the Pratt. If you park at the Franklin Street Garage after 4 o'clock, we'll give you a voucher. It's good for $5, which is free parking. So when I took over this gig 6 months ago, it was, I love the library and I love author programs, but I hate parking downtown. And so no longer can that be an excuse. And with that said, tonight I'm happy to welcome Lyle Jeremy Rubin to the Pratt for a discussion of his new book, Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body, a Marine's Unbecoming. Lyle Jeremy Rubin served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 5 years and is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian. In Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body, he reflects on his military service that resulted in his disillusionment with American foreign policy and his questioning of the impact the war on terror has on national security. In her review of the book, historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote, "This is not your ordinary military memoir. It is not often that one experiences a truly original mind, a way of thinking combined with literary skill and grounded in hard-learned humility. But that is Lyle Jeremy Rubin, on his path from acting as an instrument of empire
to deconstructing it and understanding the true meaning of freedom, community, and ethics. Never has a takedown of militarism, capitalism, and empire been more powerful and persuasive. And Pulitzer Prize-winning author Greg Grandin wrote, "Weakness might or might not leave the body, but wisdom and empathy flow." And upon reading Rubin's gripping account of his time as a post-9/11 soldier, Rubin's book is an intellectual and moral challenge, a war memoir that forces the reader to wrestle as much with ideas as with battle stories. Rubin's beautiful Hemingway-esque clipped cadence is perfect for trying to make sense of our Baroque, wounded world. This evening, Lyle Jeremy Rubin will be joined in conversation by Stuart Schrader. Mr. Schrader is a research professor in the Center for Africana Studies and the Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University. He is also the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. It's my great pleasure to welcome Lyle Jeremy Rubin and Stuart Schrader to the Pratt.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for being here. It's great to see everybody out tonight. And I'm really so thrilled to be here to discuss Lyle's book. So I guess I want to just begin by saying congratulations. This book is really amazing. And it's a really powerful piece of work. And of course, I recommend everybody read it. You know, soldiers' memoirs frequently are powerful. They're usually talking about powerful topics, but they can often be trite, they can be predictable, and there's absolutely nothing predictable about this book. I don't even know if the word memoir really gives justice to what it does. I think it's really a profound analysis. It's beautifully written. The prose is really sharp and cutting at times. I think that everybody who reads the book will learn a great deal about what it means to say that the United States has maintained an empire for decades or for over a century, and how war and empire have become defining features of what it means to be the United States. Usually we tend to think freedom, democracy, liberty, those are the words that we would apply to say that are the defining features of the United States. But I think this book compels us to think that war and empire are the defining features. In particular, it's a really deep examination of what permanent war since September 11th has done to this country, done to the world, and done to all of us as individuals. It reveals, of course, who its author was and is and maybe will be. But I think it also reveals who all of us have been, and how war itself, even if we don't know it, shapes and determines who we are, what the kind of limits of our world actually, how the limits have been imposed by war that the United States has been pursuing around the globe. I think it's kind of, one thing that we often hear in the United States, particularly after September 11th, is that like the wars that the United States was waging, it was able to wage these wars because they didn't require great sacrifice on the part of American people. So therefore the wars were able to continue. But I think the book really shows that like we've all actually sacrificed quite a lot. Even if individually it might not be, the ramifications might not be totally clear. They might feel distant. These wars have shaped our politics. They've shaped our social lives. They've constrained and narrowed our political horizons in the United States. The United States, of course, attempted to bring liberal democracy to Iraq, to Afghanistan. And, just reading the first few pages of the book, you kind of get the sense like, how can anybody ever have thought that was going to work? How sort of delusional it is to think that you could use Marines to bring democracy. So I just want to flag a couple points, and then I'll ask Lyle to read some of the text. First, this is a book that puts gender and sexuality at the center of its analysis, which I found so compelling and original. I think that we tend to, in my own work, I think a lot of people tend to analyze US empire through the language of, or the analysis of race and racism. And I think Lyle's really shown that it's possible to do a kind of deep excavation of empire and war with gender at the center of the analysis. And at the same time, of course, he never lets go of the racial dimensions of US empire, which just makes it all the more powerful. And I just want to flag maybe one other point. Every memoir that you've all read probably, inherently there's a transformation that the author goes through, and the memoir is about, going from one version of the author's self to another version. I think in this case, the transformation is a political transformation, a political awakening in some ways. And I think that that's not actually something that is typically rewarded or even talked about in our contemporary politics, our contemporary culture. The idea of political transformation, I think, is something that we don't tend to think about all that much. And one thing that I was sort of compelled to reflect on reading the book was that our sort of allergy to thinking about political transformation, the idea that like we're hardwired to be like red or blue or whatever term you want to use. Yeah, I was just kind of compelled to think like our allergy to thinking that way, it might itself be an effect of this permanent state of war that the United States is in. The notion that we can't change our understanding of the world, that we can't grow, that we can't evolve, we can't reinterpret, I think I feel like it's almost this kind of inability to be introspective about what the United States is, what the role of the United States is in the world. I kind of feel like this is just like what the book compelled me to think. It's like the United States, it's like the Wile E. Coyote cartoon. It's like we ran off a cliff, and as long as we don't look down, as long as we don't have that kind of introspective moment to kind of question like why we were running in the first place, we won't fall. And I think that the U.S. is just kind of like operating on that level as a result of permanent war. As long as we don't, stop and question like why is this the state of affairs, we can just keep going. And I think that's just like led to profound lack of certainly, obviously, political humility, but also just like the kind of political introspection and ability to go through transformation that Lyle has demonstrated so powerfully in this book. So, the book is about broader social systems, of course, and he does just a remarkable job of going from his own kind of individual experiences to thinking in really capacious terms about our social world and our political world, and it's just really remarkable. So I wanted to invite you to read some pages of the book to start us off, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for those remarks. I'm flattered, and you definitely read parts of the book that I was hoping people would be able to read from it. And just for anyone in the audience who's not aware of Badgers Without Borders, it's a book that very much shaped my own thinking on empire and imperialism, and particularly the racial aspects of both. So yeah, I recommend that as well. And then I want to thank everyone in the audience for being here. I know how difficult it is, especially these days, to get out to do anything. So I very much appreciate all of you being here. This is my first book event my entire life, so it means a lot to me. And I also want to thank Cleve and Sophia and anyone else who was involved in organizing the event. So the first reading is going to be, it's toward the beginning of the book, and I'm basically describing, it has to do with my childhood, and it also has to do with going to Officer Candidate School the first time in Quantico, Virginia. So when I say OCS, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Officer Candidate School. And I just been writing about my friend group in high school and relationships with my father. To be a man in the Marines was to be like my father or Adam's brother. It was to channel life's difficulties into rage, store one's rage like a battery stores energy, and then apply such rage to whatever battle must be won. It was also to fail to contain that rage, like a corroded battery leaks acid. But to be a man in the Marines was also more than that. There was a naturalization of the boyish violence I got to know as a child, a violence that conditioned everyone involved, from the perpetrator to the victim to the witness, to become not only accustomed to its blunt impact, but also maybe even welcoming of it. And it was a special kind of violence that doubled as something sexual. Reimagining that violence in recent years has meant placing it in its proper context. It has meant seeing it as of a piece with my decision to become a Marine and recognizing how it played out in ways subtle and explicit once I did. I often drift back to the collective humiliation, when we were all, the whole platoon, at our most exposed, at our most naked, literally. I think back to our headlong discarding of tops, trousers, and briefs in between our racks. I recall the tripping and wobbling as we barreled to the head all at once, its entryway halfway down the narrow building on the starboard side, to take our shits and pisses or scrub our bodies under the high-pressure showers. We had only 5 minutes to conduct the aforementioned, so we sprinted and elbowed as if future generations depended on it. We were always aware of one another's bodies, bodies knocking into one another, moving in sync. Our sprints were expertly orchestrated, lest we slip on the wet deck. Our elbowing was subtle, just about invisible, lest we risk needless frictions or full-blown tussles with those we relied on. Our pisses were well aimed and efficient, lest we frustrate the man to our immediate left or right at the trough urinal, or the dozen men queued up behind us, bursting to let one out before deadline. Insecurities were everywhere. I saw star lacrosse players bite their lower lips in humiliation after nicking themselves during a speed shave. I saw them jerk in all directions to make sure no one saw what I saw, and dab the slit with toilet paper, resolved to let it dry in a manner least conducive to judgment. I saw former shortstops assess their own pecs as they stood next to the more developed pecs of others. Then I saw them scour their breasts with a bar of soap in a self-conscious fit, as if peeking was a mere preparatory step to chest cleaning. I saw everyone sweat trying not to be caught stealing glimpses at others' cocks, and I saw the childlike mortification of everyone involved when someone was. The 5 weeks I spent disintegrating at OCS amounts to a haze. I was too beaten down to make much of it. But the one element that has always stayed with me, like a gelatinous burn, is the feeling of having been placed in an enclosed environment with men who were, despite their current attainments and skill sets, not all that different from my father or from me and Adam. That is to say, men who had once been made to feel weak or inadequate. Men who, like most, were now figuring out roles passed down to them by patriarchs, whether from real life or from the big or small screen. Men obsessed with protecting and enriching themselves and those they cherished. Men who collected taxing experiences and challenges as if they were armor for battles ahead. Men, in the ultimate instance, concerned with preserving and combining their gains, ordering and controlling anything or anyone on the outside who might get in their way. Men, by gradations and in various phases, not so much in search of freedom and democracy as of their own manhood.
So I guess my question for you is about your decision to put these questions of gender and masculinity at the center of the analysis and of the story. I mean, at what point did you realize in becoming a writer and writing this book that this was the way to make sense of it, or was it always clear from the get-go?
So yeah, it definitely wasn't clear from the get-go. I remember when I first sat down to write my first drafts, I really didn't know what the main theme of of the book would end up being. I mean, I knew I had some ideas about where I wanted to go with the story, but it was, you know, it's kind of hard to write about one's experience in the military, especially the Marine Corps, without ending up centering gender. It's just such a basic fact of Marine Corps life. And even at the time, you know, maybe I wasn't able to consciously really confront a lot of these issues. Like I felt it. I felt the manly insecurities or boyish insecurities all around me. I felt it in myself. And I ended up feeling it even more as the years went by. And I think most decisively, I felt it in Afghanistan. And it was that feeling of being a part of extreme violence, and at the same time, feeling like a boy and feeling like everyone around me was a boy. And we were all playing out these experiences that you know, took place many, many years before we landed in Afghanistan. So yeah, I think.
So do you, based on what you just said, do you feel like the people you know, the other particularly male Marines you met along the way, you know, were they drawn into the Marine Corps because of their own desire to wrestle with these kind of insecurities or overcome them? Was becoming a Marine a way to overcome insecurity that then failed? You know, what was it that, you know, like you said, the experience of being a Marine, you can't escape gender. it's always there, obviously. Yeah. I mean, that's true in lots of places in life, but it's really intense in the Marine Corps. And is it something about the people who become Marines, or is that too much of a generalization?
So one thing I struggled with is when I got out of the Marine Corps and I started my political journey leftward, although that journey started while I was still in, you know, I was just immediately interested in class politics because, and that's something I also write about in the book, is I was enlisted, I was an officer, I came from a privileged background, but then I was at boot camp. So like class was something that was very much on my mind at a much more conscious level for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I struggled with how I could talk about gender and manliness and masculinity while not downplaying like also the very blatant class aspect of all this. I do think we were just talking about in the green room that like there's a commercial that I believe is still playing for the Marine Corps, for maybe the Army, where it's a number of young people around a fire pit. One of them says, "I've just joined the Navy," or whatever branch it was. And they're like, "Oh, why'd you join?" He's like, "Well, I'm getting free housing and I'm getting free healthcare and I'm getting free education. I got job security. Like, you know, look at rents these days. Like, how could I live otherwise?" And then someone else goes and says, "Oh, well, at my workplace, I get free bagels." And then that's the end of the commercial. So like, I still think that's like fundamental to the reason people join. Even, and not just poor people, like also the middle class in this country is also, you know, hollowed out to a large degree. You know, at times 70 upwards to 80% of the country, you know, is more or less living paycheck to paycheck. So, you know, I struggle with that. Mm-hmm. But I think there's been a lot written and said about the poverty draft. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there hasn't been as much written about how masculinity and manliness, not only is a central fact of the military, but also of like the broader foreign policy mm-hmm. and power relations that the military is serving. I mean, I guess this is the other aspect of it. I'm writing about the micro gender aspects at play in my own experience, but I'm also slowly realizing or seeing American foreign policy and America's place in the world in a very new light. I'm seeing it as this kind of very severe paternalistic figure in the world, mm-hmm. Very stern and also just totally fraught with this dialectic between, this relationship between obsession with always self-defense and national security, but also this profound insecurity. And how it's this negative feedback loop where you're just constantly creating enemies to feel, to kind of play out this search for a manly security.
Maybe I'll ask you to read another section here that I think illustrates some of these themes that you've just been referencing. So the section on
Sure.
102.
So yeah, if anyone has the book, this is on 102, and this is when I'm at 29 Palms, California. I was still an enlisted Marine at this time, and I was learning a trade that I ended up abandoning because I ended up becoming an officer. But and I was with a group of Marines, and I'm kind of describing how we related to each other and how we would hang out on our off hours and the language we would use. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. I have not recreated the speech of my prior selves, friends, and peers because I find such language tolerable, nor do I aspire to a role as word cop. As a writer, I'm sensitive to the words one uses. I prize kindness and consideration. I also recognize norms are fluid. I would say the same about gender and sexuality. A world in which there is only one proper set of behaviors for this or that gender, one set of rules for being romantic or sexual, is not a world I would like to live in. There are infinite ways to explore one's needs or desires without superfluous pain. Some more conventional, some less so. Some gravitate towards softness, others something harder. Sublimated brutalities can prove healing and fun. The problem is when these things become problems, not just for those most enwrapped in them, but also, and of more relevance, for the world. Machines of exploitation and violence leverage these problematic means of relating to one another through language or touch. The line here can blur. Research has shown that those who exhibit the personality trait of fearless dominance gravitate more toward professions of domination, whether in the armed services, the policing panopticon, the carceral archipelago, or perhaps the upper reaches of corresponding domains of finance, real estate, fossil fuels, corporate law and politics, media, or lobbying. Likewise, those who display this trait are often those who have experienced prior trauma. This is not to say those who have been hurt are bound to hurt others, although we all are to some degree. It is that those who hold the grimmest whips tend to be those who have themselves been scarred. I'd also submit that it is those who have become convinced that the only way to survive and thrive is to be on the more comfortable end of the whipping, and that the empire makes use of this drive and those prone to it. And in a very literal sense, the empire weaponizes such people and their drives. It manufactures them. Through the exacerbation of machine-like cruelties, it reproduces and disseminates them from one place to another, from one time to the next. It might have been Pat who started Captain Retardo and Captain Cripple, but most of us use them at some point. Putting aside the intent of such turns of phrase, they tell us something about those who use them and the communities in which we learn to use them. These are communities where the ability to protect or enrich oneself in the most practical or macho of ways is held in highest esteem, and where those incapable of doing so are seen as defective. Their primary worth for others becomes that of a punching bag, or maybe for training purposes, a stack of bayoneted tires. Communities like this have existed across cultures and eras. The earth is made of bitter, barren stuff. But empire, the maximal achievement of unjustifiable organized force, not only guarantees these communities, but also cements them as our only fathomable possibility.
Thanks. One of the things that I found so compelling in the book was this kind of point that threads through the experiences that you talk about, particularly in Afghanistan, which is this kind of longing either to kill or to be killed. It's this kind of paradox where so much of being a Marine is directed toward, this climax of one of those two options. And yet the reality, the everyday reality of being a Marine actually is a lot of drudgery and a lot of work that is far from the front, where the likelihood for many Marines of either being able to kill or being at risk of getting killed is actually quite low. And so it seemed like you and others that you were around are constantly kind of wrestling with this intense desire for the thing that Marines are designed to do, which is to kill, and yet the inability to actually realize that. I found that just like so fascinating and interesting, and I wonder if you could talk about how that played out in your experience in Afghanistan, and also in all the training that led up to your deployment.
Yeah. So, well, to begin with the Afghanistan piece, I imagine most of you are familiar with this, but for those of you who might not be, I mean, most of the real kind of like movie-like combat is mostly being reserved for special forces. So conventional troops, including Marines, often, while we do take part in violence and we experience violence, it's often not as Hollywood often depicts it. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan and I was on the front lines visiting my Marines and occasionally going on foot patrols with them, I mean, really what their everyday routine consists of was walking through minefields effectively, and or just policing these, very small remote villages. And occasionally there might be like a firefight of some kind, but it's often at a distance. And then if it gets really hot, then you call in air support. So I guess one of the things I started thinking about when I was out there, and even before, I mean, even during training, you kind of get a sense of this. People that have already been will tell you, oh yeah, like if you're not special forces, you're just the most you can hope for is to like not land on a mine, basically. I just felt like there was a kind of a contradiction here, because everyone was very gung-ho and always talking about kill, kill, kill. And there was this very kind of idealized notion of masculine aggression and masculine bravery and sacrifice. And yet we all knew at the same time that this wasn't going to be the reality of our war to a large degree. And for a lot of us, it wasn't. Either that meant never even making it to the front lines and just being on a big base the entire time with a TGI Fridays or a Pizza Hut. Or if you are on the front lines, you were either just kind of walking around in the desert, or if there was any kind of firefight, you basically called in the heavy guns from the air. And that I think people were aware of this. There was kind of almost a hypocrisy there. I don't know if hypocrisy is the right word, but I think we felt embarrassed by that. I think there was kind of a kind of omnipresent embarrassment about the overall mission that we are involved in. And I don't want to speak for everyone, because I know fellow Marines of mine that did experience really heavy combat. And I know others did as well. But that was certainly my experience, and it was a lot of people's experience. And I think it's often not an experience that most Americans are familiar with. Or at least we don't really like take time to investigate, to think more deeply about this.
And one point that comes up in the book, again, as I sort of suggested, the ramifications of what the U.S. is doing overseas for our domestic sphere, and one of the things that you talk about is the way that this kind of lust for violence that is inculcated for Marines to go into combat, whether they actually experience combat or not, has come back home and infiltrated into things like police training and attitudes that people hold about gun rights and so forth. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the way that exactly what you're talking about, this feeling of kind of unfulfilled training for violence has really pertinent ramifications back home as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I got home, I started thinking about these things, but it really wasn't until the rise of Trump and Black Lives Matter and seeing all this video footage, like every second of every day of police, brutalizing all sorts of, all across the country. And there was a real pathetic quality to all of it. Like a lot of the videos of these cops, there was just something so pathetic about what they were doing. I mean, aside from being horrific, it was also pathetic. They had all the guns. They had all the, the militarized gear, the same kind of gear that I had in Afghanistan. And yet they were still convincing themselves that they were somehow the real men in the room. And it very much reminded me of my own experience in the military. And, and then Trump, and you look at all these figures that are just in the news constantly now, Elon Musk, there's a real pathos to all of them. There's something so ridiculous and about all of them. And I guess what I became interested in was not just like the individual pathos of all these people or these individual, pathetic moments, in American policing, but how these express a deeper reality about America and about empire. I mean, there's plenty, I think the best writers on empire always end up writing about this, that empire is driven by insecurity. It's this pathetic insecurity, this need for feeling safe. And how, that need that is never really addressed in any kind of healthy manner ends up leading to not only, atrocious forms of violence and aggression, but also just ridiculous, pathetic displays of aggression and violence. I mean, it's hard to live in America and not laugh in like the darkest sense, because it's not just that we're in a deeply unequal and violent society, but we're a deeply pathetic one. And I think until we can face that, and at this point, unfortunately, we seem to be running out of time, but then what I'm talking, it will just continue to get worse. I mean, we have to I don't want to speak in the grand we or royal we right now, but yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Maybe pivoting slightly, one of the things that really comes through in this book is the way that your ideas about the world changed from your childhood to the present, and it's clear perhaps that throughout your life you've always been a reader, and reading and texts have shaped who you are and shaped also the different versions of yourself that are on view in the book. So I wonder if you could just talk about the power of reading and learning and texts for how you came to be who you are and write the book that you wrote?
Yeah, so I think in the beginning, I mean, I was actually like a really bad reader in the beginning. I think most people are. Like, I was definitely reading to justify my own bullshit, you know, like as a kid. I was upset at my dad, so I read all this right-wing crap to piss off my dad, and you know, and then now that I was a right winger because I wanted to piss off my dad, I actually had to like come up for arguments for why I was a right winger. So then I was reading books to find these arguments. And then 9/11 happens, and you know, at a subconscious level, I see this as an opportunity for me to finally become a man. But then I'm reading all these books about why we need to be in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you know, why I need to be there. But I think in time, you know, I think I ended up reading. I became a better reader. I ended up reading as a consequence of my doubts rather than my, you know, my inner anxieties and neuroses. And I started being attracted to all sorts of writers and thinkers who, you know, were making me feel, were expressing the discomfort that I was feeling about myself and about the institution that I was a part of. I mean, I could go on and on about the whole literary journey. It's in the book, but like, I mean, one thing I will emphasize, to go back to the theme of gender and manliness, is I was also, for a long time, I was reading all the great men of literature. And that was kind of happening at the same time that I was becoming a Marine. And I think my unbecoming, to a large degree, was not only me turning away from this Marine ethos, but also turning away from this great man archetype. And you know, I started reading more women, and then I started reading more people that weren't white, and you know, and more queer writers and all the rest. And that was in unison with me unbecoming my Marineness. And I think that wasn't a coincidence. I think like that's central to like my understanding of what a Marine form of manliness, you know, represents, and what an alternative might represent.
Maybe I want to open it up to the audience, but maybe just one last question. Obviously, the book just came out, but what is your sense of when your fellow Marines who you were with in Afghanistan or you were with in OCS, if they pick up the book, what is your sense of what their reaction is going to be?
So I actually already had, well, some Marine friends of mine have already read different parts of it, but a Marine from my boot camp platoon, who I've stayed in touch with through Facebook through the years, he got it immediately, and I think he's already like 3 or 4 chapters in. So he's already read the boot camp chapter. And he just started shooting me all sorts of messages through Facebook. And, you know, it was like, I think like overall it was very like, you can tell he's thinking a lot more about this stuff. And I feel like that's the response I've mostly gotten from at least the ones that are willing to reach out to me. It's like, they have questions and they want to put, you know, they disagree with me on this or that. But there's like there's a sense of like excitement there, like that they're finally getting to talk to someone about certain things that they just haven't been given the opportunity to talk about. And I guess I'm writing to a lot of different audiences, but to me it was very important to write like first and foremost with my peers in mind in the Marine Corps. And you know, I'm sure I'll get all sorts of negative reactions as well, but I mean, it's been nice so far, like the reaction I've been getting from some of my fellow Marines.
Great. So we'd love to take some questions from the audience. We just need you to use the microphone so that people who are watching on the live stream can hear your question.
Yeah, we got about 15 minutes for questions, so.
Thank you for coming, and I enjoyed listening to you. I was wondering, when you talk about masculinity and gender and sexuality, within the construct of the Marines, and in your experience, how did women fit into that? When there were if you had women within your group, or how did you see that masculinity play out in that way?
Sure. So when you first go to boot camp, and then to a lesser extent, officer candidate school, but definitely boot camp, at least when I was there, the women had their own side of the island. And once in a while you would march by them, or they would march by you. And they were very much like the other. They were the opposite of us. So just think of any term for women that a Marine might use in this context. Whenever we spotted them, the drill instructors would be like, "You're not one of those, you're not this, you're not that." Or maybe you are, they'll be like, "Oh, you're just like," so they were always a foil for our own manliness, and for our own our own rubrics for whether we were being good Marines or not, was whether we were proximate or not proximate to the woman. Yeah, after boot camp, you ended up, it was integrated training, at least for me, at the Marine combat training. So I was actually, for the first time, I was in a platoon with women. And I could go on and on about the interactions, which, like anything else, there was a wide range of different kinds of interactions, and some of it was healthy and a lot of it wasn't. And military sexual trauma now is thankfully a much more popular term than it was when I was in. When I was in, there was very little being written about MST. But I write about it in the book, but when I get to 29 Palms, California, at the military occupational school I was at, you would have, every week you would have a new class from Marine combat training that would show up, and there would only be a few women each time. And, I got to know some of them, and others I know got to know some of them. And it was just, they were targets. And I don't want to be totally reductive about it, because some of them really enjoyed this experience of being having the attention. But a lot of times they didn't end up enjoying it. And there was no accountability at all. If there was any accusations lodged at all against anyone, it was immediately dismissed, not only by the fellow enlisted Marines, but by the chain of command. And this is just so obvious. And I remember having conversations with my girlfriend at the time about this, and she's a journalist, and we were actually thinking about maybe strategizing so she could write a story about this. But yeah, there's some legislation for trying to get the investigative powers removed from the chain of command, the military command, and move it to a more civilian capacity. And I think that's really important. But I would argue that as long as we're going to have an imperialist military, we're going to have tremendous amounts of sexual violence, both within the military and without it. So does that answer your question? Hey.
Do you think Trump should have ended the war? And it appears that Afghanistan has money in the stock market, and it seems like the power of the United States won't give them their assets. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so their own reserves have basically been appropriated by the United States. And they have, I used to know the amount, but it's a very poor country. So you have was it 7? Do you know 7 billion? Like,
It's
yeah,
it's
I mean,
it's not a huge amount.
yeah, it's like $7 billion, and like the overwhelming majority of it was just taken by the United States, and with the intent of giving it to the families of 9/11 victims. This was after the Taliban took over the country. And I mean, that's awful no matter what, but what's especially awful about it is that the central bank in Afghanistan is actually like one of the only institutions in Afghanistan that is actually like somewhat functional and actually does have like something like the interests of the public in mind, and is, you know, almost everyone that's housing and certainly leading the institution, you know, have been trained in Europe or the United States and are very sympathetic to US, European interests. So like, if there was one institution that would be willing to cooperate with the rest, you know, with the Europe and the US, it would be the central bank, and they're taking all their leverage away from them. And as a result, Afghans continue to starve, and it's actually empowering the most extreme elements in Afghanistan. I think most Americans, when they think of Afghanistan, they think of the Taliban. But you actually have ISIS now and other factions that are even more brutal and even less accountable to any kind of international judgment. So it's awful. But in answer to your original question about whether we should have left or not, you know, I personally, like, this is the problem with empire, is once you invade and occupy a country, at some point, something like this is going to happen. But on top of that, it's both the fact that like the withdrawal is always going to be horrific and ugly, but also the war itself. I mean, one of the things I couldn't stand about the media coverage of the withdrawal, they were absolutely right on covering the consequences of the withdrawal. But it was that they reported as if there's been no violence up until the point of the withdrawal. And yeah, there's a lot of important reporters out there that have covered the violence for years and were being kind of summarily ignored in the wake of the withdrawal. I'm thinking of Anand Gopal and Rosina Ali, a number of other really good reporters that have covered the regular violence that has taken place, especially in the countryside and the places that I was in. And the fact is, for most of the country, like since the withdrawal, they've experienced a lot less violence. That's just the fact of the matter. They were literally being policed by the air on a regular basis. There were drone attacks regularly. There were special forces raids regularly. And then on top of that, there were conventional forces that were doing regular patrols and all the rest. So to the extent that I'm critical of I think that probably, I mean, I wasn't there. Like, I don't know, like, I can't speak with any confidence to how it could have been done better, but it certainly seems like we could have done a better job protecting those that, worked with us. And certainly like Marines that I know and other veterans I know and active duty military I know, like, believe that very with a level of certainty that, certainly has moved me to believe them. But the idea that if we had stayed, we could have somehow reached a better point at which we could leave, I think is contradicted by what actually happened itself. I mean, the moment the US left, the whole machine collapsed. It was a house of cards. So in what world would this house of cards suddenly become something other than a house of cards? So I think it's a tragedy, but I hope it encourages Americans to think less about invading and occupying other countries as opposed to intervening in countries to prevent the kind of immediate horror that came from this withdrawal.
I have two questions.
Sure.
Somewhat connected. First of all, so you mentioned earlier that you saw this clash between the bravado or the machismo of the Marine, like we're gonna fight, go in, but then they ended up using like distance attacks with like, drones or from military airplanes. So, which is actually a form of weakness, not strength. So do you see that same thing with the withdrawal, that it was more like a form of like convenience, weakness, like it was like a quick withdrawal. There were assets that were harmed because of the quickness of it, and maybe that was also from a sign of weakness, further weakness on the military side, just for convenience, get out, do a hard stop like that. That's the first question. Second question is more of a, I guess, kind of an analysis of your perspective. Do you, because you mentioned that growing up you had some insecurities about masculinity and things like that. How did that, do you think, if at all, did it influence your view of your time in the military, of the Marines?
So in answer to your first question, yeah, I think absolutely, like the withdrawal is like, I actually also have a section in the book about all the different military terms and how they're like all just like patently sexual, like, but I mean, that's, you'll have to read the book for that, but like the withdrawal, like, and us losing the war, I mean, it's incredibly emasculating experience for those that took part on it on the imperialist side. I mean, we lost another war. And there's a really important book, Bring the War Home by Kathleen Belew, which is a whole history of veterans coming home from failed military campaigns abroad and basically turning that sense of emasculation into far-right politics. And I think we're seeing that right now. I mean, a disproportionate number of those that took part in the January 6th, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, had military backgrounds. A disproportionate number of the leadership in all the far-right groups and movements we're seeing now have military backgrounds. Do I think that the emasculation I'm talking about is the only factor involved in this? No. But I do think it's part of it. And I think it's a part that's ignored in the overall conversation. It's a very difficult conversation to have. I mean, how do you have it on MSNBC or CNN? I don't know. But I think if you look at the behavior, a lot of like these far right men, mostly men, but also, other than men, but mostly men, there's just an obvious emasculating insecurity to all of them. And yeah, I think the withdrawal certainly like exacerbated this type of dynamic that I'm talking about. In answer to your second question, I mean, kind of like what I was saying earlier, like the moment I first showed up at Officer Candidate School, there was just this feeling of just being unprotected and being afraid. And I didn't expect that. Of course I expected to some degree. I mean, you're going to the military, it's a tough place, but I became obsessed with that feeling. And I mean, the book is to a large degree like just an exploration of like, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
My question is, you mentioned earlier that when you sat down to write the book, you didn't know what you were going to write. But I'm very appreciative for the way that you arranged the anecdotes about your childhood and playing with your friends and home life and what you're reading, because they felt very relatable and sort of helped me, create a narrative for my own life. And so I'm wondering, in the writing process, did you have some sense of how your childhood pointed towards joining the Marines beforehand, or was it sitting down to write that brought those memories to the fore?
So originally I wanted to avoid my childhood. I didn't think it was especially interesting childhood. And I think like when I came back from Afghanistan, politics to me was like the way I was kind of handling all these emotions and feelings. And I think like when I first set out to write the book, I think there was a part of me that still wanted to just stay at the macro political level. But like, you know, if I was I was trying to subvert the military memoir, which meant I had to talk about my childhood to some degree, because that's kind of one of the major motifs of memoirs, including military memoirs. And yeah, I mean, it was through the process of like basically my agent being like, okay, write about your childhood, and me having to write about my childhood, that like all this stuff that was inside of me and that I was in one way or another thinking about, even though I didn't even know I was thinking about it, it just kind of all ended up making it on the page. And yeah, does that answer?
I want to thank Lyle and Stuart. Good night. Thanks for letting us be your first author event.
Oh, thank you for being here.
So Lyle will be outside to sign your book in just a moment. Again, Urban Read books have copies. Please purchase a copy, get it signed. Again, Lyle and Stuart, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This is harder. Yeah, it's like, do I sign the books?
I guess we probably need to get to
Okay.
Okay.